Well, hello, folks. Welcome to this Tuesday afternoon. Had to check on the day of the week because, boy, has it been a busy period. And depending on how much you follow what's going on around the country and around the world, a rather overwhelming one the last couple of weeks. I think that's fair to say. Thanks for joining. And I did want to engage with some of these rather tumultuous developments within the United States because they do relate to the theme of today's office hours and the broader conversation surrounding efforts to save the NSF National Center for Atmospheric Research, commonly known as NCAR, from its proposed dismantling by the federal government this year. So, for those of you who remember, this has been a topic that I've been following very closely since late last year when the federal government, through unofficial channels, actually initially only on the social media network X and nowhere else, announced that there was going to be a dismantling of the National Center for Atmospheric Research, essentially without much pretext or much context, that this was going to be something that took place relatively rapidly early in 2026. And this was followed up with reinforcing language more formally from the White House, arguing that the center was conducting woke research, I believe is the direct quote. And again, I'm quoting directly because I still, to this day, don't know exactly what that means in the context of studying the fluid dynamics of the atmosphere and the way that it affects weather and climate. But since then, there have been a flurry of developments, and it's, I think, hopefully helpful to sort of enumerate what has happened and talk about what might be next, because the path remains a little bit uncertain. And there is going to be probably quite a bit of time between now and whenever the final resolution is, and I hope that final resolution is that NCAR continues to be able to offer world-class products, data products, models, services related to understanding weather and climate and predicting weather and climate, and maybe even most importantly, translating that fundamental science into action, into more accurate weather predictions, more timely weather warnings that make it to the right people at the right time when it's most needed. So, okay, so just a brief recap for those who might be wondering or who might not have joined those conversations earlier in December. What is NCAR? Well, NCAR, again, is the acronym that stands for the National Center for Atmospheric Research. The full name today is actually the NSF, or National Science Foundation, National Center for Atmospheric Research, so named because a little more than half of the funding for NCAR does come from the federal government, mainly through the National Science Foundation. And in fact, the NCAR is one of a number of federally supported, I'm just looking at my notes to make sure I get the term right, federally supported FFRDCs, or the federally funded research and development centers. So other federal agencies actually have more of these than does the NSF or the National Science Foundation, but one of the relatively few that NSF does support has been for a long time now the National Center for Atmospheric Research, or NCAR. So that's where the NSF in NSF NCAR comes from. And as a substantively supported entity under the auspices, or at least partially under the auspices of NSF, it is subject to federal appropriations, meaning federal funding, and the legislation that surrounds the funding of federal agencies like NSF. NSF also is somewhat subject to the changing political priorities from one presidential administration to the next. I think it's fair to say that in the current administration, political pressure is playing a far greater role in priority setting within NSF and other federal agencies than we have seen in living memory. But in general, there is, even in an ordinary circumstance, some level of discretion and priority shifts that do occur from administration to administration, although I would reemphasize that the present situation is extreme. NSF, as I mentioned, supports NCAR directly through essentially a block grant and is operating under a 5-year agreement most of the time. And is currently in the middle of one such 5-year agreement, I would add. NCAR also, though, as I mentioned, although it does receive a slim majority of its funding from NSF, it does receive, therefore, a considerable amount of funding from other federal agencies, including some additional money from NSF on a competitive individual grant basis. So essentially, sometimes NCAR scientists can augment the funding that their parent organization receives from NSF by writing a scientific proposal to study some particular process over a multi-year period. And so that's another way that funding can be boosted a bit. And the rest comes from similar competitive grants, mostly from other federal agencies that flow through or into NCAR. And NCAR does have about 5 or 10% private funding, because it isn't a federal government entity unto itself. So it can and does accept private funding to work on public interest related weather and climate projects. For example, the insurance industry has historically offered some funding to specific NCAR scientists to study the connection between extreme weather and in losses, either loss of life, loss of property, and also the context of those extreme events in a warming climate, because there's no industry like the insurance industry when it comes to the brutal honesty about where we're headed, because that's the business model. If you don't estimate the risk correctly, and if the risk is changing over time, you've got to update your priors constantly. And this is something that the insurance industry is struggling with today, how to quantify this, and that's one of the reasons they've supported NCAR scientists in pursuing that important work, because it does affect their bottom line as well as the rest of society. So what I really want to emphasize here is that NCAR is an unusual organization. It is one of these FFRDCs, this particular one primarily supported by NCAR, but it does also receive private funding, and I think that's a testament to the perceived value of NCAR, because it's not by any means something that consumes more taxpayer dollars than it saves in the long run. It has a very high and well-articulated ROI over decades in terms of the research and educational expenditures that it entails, and societal benefit, not just sort of these intangible societal benefits, although those can be really important, but even the direct dollars saved per dollars invested in terms of losses averted for the economy, for specific sectors even of the economy, and for specific industries, because of course accurate weather prediction, timely weather warnings, and also the ability to know when a major event is not going to hit, all of these have considerable economic value that greatly exceed the cost of even the foundational research that allows us to do these things, let alone the cost of creating these predictions in real time. So the other piece I want to emphasize is that the actual organization NCAR operates as well as being connected to NSF, operates under the auspices of UCAR, the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, and this is a nonprofit consortium of over 100 American universities. So NCAR is actually operated by UCAR, which is a nonprofit essentially of many, if not most, major universities and some non-major universities in the United States that have some interest or role in studying weather, climate, and natural hazards, the oceans, wildfires, any of these things. And so it has a very strong educational component as well as research. And not only are NCAR scientists pursuing foundational research into weather and climate and related topics, but they're also really working to provide the next generation of scientists who will continue to do those things. And not just within the federal government, not even just within the state of Colorado, where NCAR is physically based, but all around the country and all around the world. Most atmospheric scientists in the country, and many people who are oceanographers or disaster-related scientists or wildfire scientists, have cycled through NCAR at some point, either as a visitor or attending a workshop, or even if they haven't ever been here in person, used NCAR resources, the supercomputing facilities that NCAR operates that are available to anybody with an NSF grant, and many people who do not have NSF grants, including researchers and professors at member institutions all across the country, so those universities that are part of UCAR, and also non-member institutions as well. So this is a really incredible resource for not only for the fundamental research, not only for the research that is very applied in sort of science to action in terms of translating improved understanding of weather and climate into better outcomes societally and economically, but also in terms of education, where NCAR has a really important role in educating, especially at the upper end of the educational scale, where you have not only university scientists, but also graduate students who are studying these things, and even undergraduate students. In fact, I've been there when there are elementary school kids on a tour learning about weather and climate. So there really is actually a role at NCAR for educational activities and opportunities from local to national and even international scales, all the way from K through 12 education, and in developing some really amazing virtual educational resources for educators as well that are really useful for primary school education and secondary school education all the way up through the college level, and also training the scientists themselves who are getting advanced degrees or who are even tenured professors themselves. It's a pretty amazing place in that sense, where you can physically show up and see everyone from about the age of 8 to 80. And yes, I literally do mean 8 to 80. There are some dedicated scientists, emeritus scientists there, who continue to do that, who play a role in the organization and in the research that it produces. So that's, in a nutshell, what NCAR is, what NCAR does, and sort of how it operates. And what was so surprising by what happened late last year is that there was this effort by a fairly limited number of people in the executive branch to rapidly curtail and even shut down NCAR. Dismantle it is the word used, but really it kind of sounds like an effort to tear NCAR down for parts, as it were, ostensibly separating the weather, the ostensibly legitimate weather research from the ostensibly illegitimate climate research. And I think the challenge is that this is really not something, that would be desirable, I would argue, even if it were possible. But maybe more importantly, it's just not something that is even possible from a sort of a process perspective and from a science perspective. And just give me a minute here. I'm trying to make sure that the stream doesn't have too many issues. I don't know why the video quality is a little bit choppy. I'm still working on this. I'm not a streaming engineer, so I think where we were late last year was we had this proclamation from the White House, from the executive branch. Russell Vogt was the one who made the announcement on social media initially. And you know what? I'm actually going to, because this is now the third time this has happened, in terms of the choppy video, give me like 30 seconds. I'm just going to go in and change the streaming bit rate, because I think that's what the problem is. I don't know why. Once again, the streaming software updated and changed the default settings without my permission. So just bear with me for a second. All right, here we go. All right, so let's see if that's better. I actually think I made that change relatively quickly. So let's just see. I'm not sure if it has applied, but let me just double check to make sure this is connected as expected. Okay, we'll see how that goes. So just giving it a few seconds for those changes to apply here. All right, hopefully the video lagginess is now going to just magically go away with that update. So what we had heard as of late last year was that there was going to be an efforts would be put into motion. It was not exactly clear how this was going to work procedurally or administratively, and it remains unclear, although NSF did send a letter to NCAR stating intent to dismantle. So it does sound like the elements within NSF whose purview is at least partly shaped by partisan politics have decided that they're not going to defend NCAR from within on the NSF side. But even here, it's not clear exactly what was next, because, of course, NSF is funded through federal appropriations, and federal appropriations are dictated by Congress through spending bills or appropriations bills. When there is a gap in appropriations, that is essentially that's when we see those government shutdowns, like we saw the one late last year. And there is a new late January, I believe it's January, the end of this January deadline for a new appropriations bill to fund the government. Otherwise, there could be another shutdown. And I think the strategy right now has been to separate different pieces of those congressional appropriations into different smaller appropriations bills to approve them incrementally. So there is maybe less pressure to add so-called poison pills or riders or things that are unrelated to the core funding contents. And there is one such bill right now that has been receiving fairly bipartisan support to fund commerce, justice, and the sciences. So this does include a lot of the 3- and 4-letter federal science agencies. And this is essentially what the Colorado senators, so Senators Hickenlooper and Bennett, I believe, have been trying to essentially inject language to explicitly protect NCAR into. So there had been a stated effort within this appropriations package to explicitly carve out a statement that essentially said that NCAR funding for this coming appropriations bill for the coming fiscal year would be the same, more or less the same as last year's, which would mean, presumably, that NCAR is not dismantled. But there was, for a variety of reasons, that appears not to have happened. The final language in this bill does not include any specific language protecting NCAR. even though, from a top-line perspective, the overall content of this bill appears to be much more favorable for sciences in the United States, for federal funding of science and of science-related agencies, than the White House budget request from last year. So I've talked previously about how the White House budget request would be just nothing short of catastrophic for virtually all branches of science. There have already been some catastrophic events in the American science world already that have nothing to do with congressional appropriations. Keep in mind that everything that's happened so far, all of the mass firings, the partisan political ideological banning of certain words and topics of research and phrases and whole fields, subfields of science from federal funding, has nothing to do with anything that's been authorized by Congress. There has been, up to this point, plenty of money. There has been more money than has actually been allocated, let's say. You could argue about whether it's enough. That's a question for a different day. But the problem thus far has not been that Congress hasn't authorized enough spending for science relative to expectations. The problem has been that things have happened after the point of appropriation. So Congress authorized spending for these agencies, for NOAA, for NSF, for NASA, etc., but that some of those funds were withheld through various mechanisms essentially by the White House, and there have been many lawsuits. There's been a lot of congressional anger from people who know much more about the processes of governance than I am an expert in. But the long story short, there have been lawsuits. There's been court challenges, some of which have been successful, some of which have not. But all of the challenges we've seen so far and been talking about were not because Congress didn't authorize the money, but because something happened after that point to prevent the science from actually being conducted. And people have lost their jobs, whole fields, whole departments, whole offices of American scientists are no longer doing the good work that they were doing as a result of things that had nothing to do with congressional appropriations. Okay, we fast forward to today, where we are talking about congressional appropriations and whether or not NCAR would be protected in this round. What we're seeing is that the funding levels proposed in these appropriations bills are much higher. And I just want to refer to my notes again to make sure I get it right. Instead of these enormous catastrophic cuts for entities like NSF and NASA and NOAA, instead what we see are, in absolute dollar terms, a 3.3% top-line cut for NSF, a 1% cut for NASA, and as far as I can tell, essentially a flat budget for NOAA, which of course is vastly different than what the White House had requested. I would point out that due to inflation of, well, that's a whole nother story, but probably not too far from 3%, even a flat budget with no decrease at all would effectively be a decrease, because if you keep a flat budget and inflation eats away at about 3% of it per year, it's kind of like having a 3% cut in real terms. So when you have, for example, for NSF, a 3.3% cut on top of roughly 3% inflation, it is in essence a 6% cut in real dollar terms, which is significant, but still nowhere near as catastrophic as the White House proposal had been. So from a top-line budgetary perspective, that is certainly better news than perhaps it could have been. But within that budget bill, NCAR is not specifically enumerated as being carved out for protection, which is concerning because that leaves the situation quite open to NCAR potentially being targeted through means similar to what we saw last year. Even though the funding is appropriated and available through Congress, the money's there, the taxpayer dollars are thusly allocated, that something happens whereby there's essentially an executive branch mandate that the money not be spent on its appropriated topics. And that could potentially mean that NCAR doesn't receive its appropriated funding, or the funding appropriated through NSF. And I think that's the key, is that this budget bill doesn't specifically allocate any particular dollar amount to NCAR. It appropriates dollars to NSF, and NSF essentially gets to decide what to do with it, and NSF has articulated its intent to dismantle NCAR. So that puts us in a bit of a tricky spot with respect to the effort to save NCAR at this moment, because we don't know exactly what's going to happen next. There's a lot of other moving parts as well. As anybody who's been following national and international events knows, this has been a rather extraordinary couple of weeks in terms of rapidly escalating geopolitical instability and crises, many of which directly involve the United States, and also rapidly escalating domestic crises within the United States that all play into Congress actually needing to do other things urgently regarding war powers, for example, and other urgent legislation that needs to be negotiated and voted on in the near term. And that has delayed the appropriations package. And depending on how things go domestically with funding of different federal agencies right now, including, for example, the Department of Homeland Security and ICE, there are efforts within Congress potentially to delay appropriations funding bills for other agencies that are not directly related to those sorts of activities, but are nonetheless part of the appropriations process. So there's a lot of moving parts, and all of this is connected. And I'm not a political scientist or a political pundit or analyst of any kind, so I'm assimilating all of this from publicly available sources, except I do have some personal insights on what is being articulated within Congress and in the White House with respect to NCAR specifically. And there is broad bipartisan support among senators and among representatives. And this is something that is truly bipartisan. It's not universally so, but there are both senators and representatives on both sides of the political aisle who do not want to dismantle NCAR. So that is important context for what I'm going to suggest in terms of what might be coming next, because there really does not appear to be any appetite among the American public, nor even within Congress, to actually dismantle NCAR, and yet the real threat right now seems to be from other than Congress, from the executive branch, and from the types of unilateral actions that we've seen recently, some of which remain to be the constitutionality or legality of which remain to be determined by the Supreme Court, potentially. So this is a moment where the continued public support for NCAR and support of the sciences remains really important. And I did want to take a step back and just reiterate here, this is not the only important thing that's happening right now. And I know that's feedback that I've received quite frequently from people. And I just want to remind folks that in moments like these, we really do have to focus on more than one thing at once. There's not only one thing that's important. There are only 2 or 3 things that are important. There are dozens of things that are all equally or superlatively, I guess I should say, important in this moment of I think it's fair to say, pretty considerable upheaval, both within the U.S. and beyond. And so this is just one piece of it. This is one piece of it that I can speak to directly and personally and with some authority and some insider knowledge relative to other things that I don't have for 95% of the rest of things that are happening right now. So it's not to say that supporting NCAR is of singular importance and is inherently more important than any other number of major things that you might be concerned about right now, and rightfully so. But it is to say it is something that I think we all should care about, because it really does affect all of us. It's also something that I think is tractable. It is possible to save NCAR. There is no foregone conclusion at this point. In fact, it's really not even clear exactly how NCAR would be dismantled. So short of something really dramatically changing, the money is going to be there to fund NCAR at essentially the same level that it's been funded recently. in a different universe, it might be nice if we were increasing spending on weather and climate related research and prediction. But for the moment, anyway, flat funding for NSF, or only, I guess I should say, a relatively modest decrease in top line NSF funding should not pose an existential threat to NCAR on its own. So hopefully we can sort of take a step back from that abyss. And the question then becomes, A, is it possible to still include that language to explicitly protect NCAR in these appropriations bills? Or if not, which it sort of sounds like it might not be at this point, it sounds like the language of these bills is likely finalized, what can be done after the fact to have a really big public showing of support for NCAR? Because everything that happens after those funds are appropriated, frankly, it's less of a formal process. Congress allocates the funds, and NSF and the White House, perhaps, will be to various degrees responsive to public pressure. And I do think this is something that if you are concerned about the potential loss of NCAR, as I think we all have reason to be, whether or not we're in the weather or climate community, or if we just rely on weather forecasts or severe weather warnings or wildfire outlooks or climate change projections, or if we are concerned about insurance premiums increasing because of wildfire hazard or flood hazard, for example, well, where is all the data that's going into these models that's used by the insurance companies, that's used by the National Weather Service, that's used by all of these international global corporations and consortia to ship your product from China to your doorstep, from a factory somewhere else on the other side of the world to your home in the United States? All of this, all these logistics firms, all the shipping, all the insurance companies, all of it, getting safely from point A to point B in a car on the road or in a plane in the air or on a train. All of that still depends on weather forecasts and planning for the future if we don't want to have all of those transportation corridors compromised by changes, if we don't want to have uninsurable properties because insurance companies have under or overestimated the risks of certain hazards in certain places. We need this information, and we can't just stop where we did historically, because what we have today is the best available science of yesterday, but what we really need is the best available science of tomorrow. And if we stop investing in it, we're not going to get it. And NCAR, again, really is at the global epicenter of all of this. So I think most folks get it in terms of why this is important. But what can you do right now? So I have a pinned post in the chat right now, a link that you can visit, and it's essentially this is something that's been put together by, I believe, a consortium of folks at the American Meteorological Society, the American Geophysical Union, and also the Weather and Climate live stream folks. It's a link to the 5 Calls platform, and it's really just a clear, succinct script that you can use if you do want to speak with your elected representatives about the value of NCAR, the importance of protecting it, and what we lose if we don't have it. It's a very short script, just a few sentences long, and really you can call any of your elected representatives regardless of where you are. This is something that is going to be relevant across the country and across districts, red, blue, purple districts, because there is fairly broad bipartisan support, but we're still seeing that a fair number of representatives don't really know what NCAR is still. Those who know what it is, probably not coincidentally, are quite supportive of it. And again, this is where this stretches across the aisle. But I still think there are a lot of folks who have some vague sense that it's weather and climate related, but how unique is it really? Is it just another office building that does the same research that's, or similar research to what's done in dozens or hundreds of other locations? And the answer is no. It is unique and irreplaceable. I think that's a message that's really useful to be getting across right now. So if you're so inclined, there's an option. You can call your local representatives. And again, this is relevant both for your senators and your reps. And it's also something that's, again, I always think there's value in talking about these things with the people in your lives, because it's something you can, it's kind of a nice way to talk about something positive too, because there's been, this is one of those federally supported efforts that's been so successful for so long. I mean, NCAR's been around for decades, and it continues to produce even more relevant work with each passing decade. The other thing I wanted to mention, and by the way, there's a couple of other links at the beginning of the chat to a couple of blog posts from people I think are reliable and have written up nice summaries of sort of what the current situation is with the federal government, NCAR standoff, if you will, and then also what sort of the timeline of events has been. So you can check those out as well. I did want to reflect a little bit on this notion that we have heard from the federal government, from Russell Vought and others, including NSF, in their letter of intent to dismantle, that NCAR's weather and climate related research will somehow be separated, and the woke climate change research will be terminated, and the legitimate weather research will be retained. And again, I'm not going to dissect exactly what the term woke means in this context, because I think it's just become a kind of a meaningless word appended to many things these days. But the fundamental thing I want to emphasize is this, and it's a little bit of an irony too, because one of the things that has become apparent in decades of atmospheric science research, much of which has been funded and supported by and conducted by NCAR, is that we probably created historically a little bit too sharp of a divide between the study of weather and the study of climate. So between meteorology, say, and climate science. And my whole career is based on deliberately blurring those lines, strategically, constructively, and thoughtfully, methodically, but still, I sometimes joke that I live a little dangerously and mix my weather and my climate, because I am, by training, a meteorologist, a weather scientist, but also a climate scientist. So my career, as many of you know, has long spanned that sort of scientific cultural divide. But the irony is that the research over decades essentially has demonstrated that that divide is artificial. That there is no clean separation between weather and climate from a physical science perspective. Because it's all the same atmosphere. The fluid dynamics operate whether or not we're talking about local weather conditions or large-scale climate. The reality is that the physics and the thermodynamics and the chemistry and the same conservation laws and the same laws of thermodynamics, they all apply whether we're talking about weather or climate. There's no fundamental difference there. There are differences in, practically speaking, in how we approach weather and climate prediction versus projection. It's not to say that there's no differences at all, but what we realize is that it's all the same atmosphere, and it's all the same ocean, and it's all the same land surface, the same cryosphere, the same biosphere that interact with the atmosphere, and the only real difference is temporal and spatial scales. So, to me, it's always seemed a little bit silly to try and separate weather and climate in some strict way, and historically it is what was done in the field. Even at NCAR, there is physical separation between the two primary campuses within Boulder, Colorado, where the global dynamics people are up in the amazing IMP building up on the mesa, and the meteorology folks, the shorter term weather folks, are down in a actually larger but less glamorous office park on the other side of town. That's a bit of a generalization. There's been more mixing, again, on purpose, because of the scientific reality that these are not really, there really is no true clear delineation between weather and climate related processes. But this was initially by design, and that physical separation, I think, of meteorology departments and earth science departments at different universities, it's only recently that there are any departments of climate science anywhere in universities around the world, you couldn't get a university degree in climate science until really the last few years. I'm starting to see that finally. But even when I was an undergraduate or even a graduate student, climate science was not something that you could actually get a specific degree in, even at that point in time. So it's something that has changed pretty rapidly. And I apologize for the lags, by the way, in the video. I really don't know what's going on at the moment, so I'll have to work on that later. I'll just add it to the queue, I guess. That's par for the course these days. But you could argue that one of the major findings from NCAR over its period of existence is that weather and climate, we need specialists in both. We need people and we need sub-entities that specialize in weather and or climate, but that ultimately the underlying science just exists along a spectrum of processes, of time scales, of spatial scales, etc. And we separate them artificially at our peril. We do better science when we integrate them. And this has even been sort of the paradigm for NCAR's progression in its modeling capacity, in its predictive physical science efforts over the years, where initially NCAR essentially built two different fundamental atmospheric models, weather models and climate models. And they're both still very useful. Those would be the weather research and forecasting model is sort of the most up-to-date weather model, and the climate and earth system, community earth system model, the CESM model, is the most recent climate sort of standalone earth system model. But most recently, the newest model out of NCAR is literally called the Model for Prediction Across Scales, or MPAS. It's sort of the culmination of the integration of weather and climate, not because there was any contrived or partisan or ideological reason for this, but in fact because it just turns out that what we really need is the ability to predict and simulate the atmosphere, and that we need to be able to do so across temporal and spatial scales, because that's what the science tells us is the way things work. So efforts to separate or to partially dismantle NCAR, as I say again, to sort of scrap it for parts and try and keep the weather parts and get rid of the climate parts, not only would that be highly undesirable, because we need that climate research, especially now of all times, as the Earth is warming at a rapid rate and the impacts of climate change are accelerating, but maybe even more fundamentally, because if we try to do so, it ain't going to work. You can't do it. There is no clean separation between weather and climate science, and there's important pieces that probably are more weather predominant or more climate predominant, but ultimately the sum is certainly greater. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts when it comes to NCAR and its weather and climate efforts. The institution has been historically as successful as it has been, as effective as it has been, as transformative and globally renowned as it has been, precisely because it doesn't focus on one small piece of the atmosphere, but looks at the whole big picture, considering the whole Earth system and the variability and change in the Earth's atmosphere across all of the relevant timescales, which encompass weather and climate, all the way from seconds, the scale of seconds, to the scale of millennia, and from the scale of an individual tree to the scale of the entire world and even planets beyond. So I think I'm gonna leave it at that in terms of the monologue. I've gone on for 45 minutes, and I know the video is a little bit laggy. I gotta figure that out. But I did want to take the opportunity to take a look at the comments, to answer any questions that folks have that are connected to today's topic. And I will have a question for the audience if well, I'll have to figure that out myself. I'm still troubleshooting on the lagginess side. In this case, it's not the internet connection, and it's not the computer. It's something about the settings in OBS, which updates every 2 or 3 weeks, and every time it messes something up. So I gotta figure out some other workflow, I think, is the only solution I can think of. Anyone who's an expert in streaming, I've tried to use the AI revolution to troubleshoot and have come up completely empty-handed in terms of useful suggestions from the LLM world. So much for that. All right, so let me take a look at the questions. I'm going to go back to the beginning here. I'll take a quick sip of water. There's a comment, several comments actually, about various industries that should care about understanding climate change or weather. And yes, and in many ways, I think that it is people who work in certain sectors of the private sector, I guess, who really understand this at a dollars and cents level, pretty intuitively. It in all cases, it's really obvious why this matters for agriculture or transportation or logistics or insurance or commodities. But then you start asking the question of, okay, so then what sectors where it doesn't really matter? And I think there are, weather and climate are fundamental to every corner of the economy, but I do think there's variability in the level of recognition of that reality in different corners of the world. And so I do think there's probably more awareness of the dependency on weather and climate and the degree to which some of the wealth that has been built over time is built atop the legacy of effective weather and climate prediction and extreme event warnings and preparedness that comes from that. A couple of comments that these sorts of updates don't seem to draw the same audience that the severe weather updates do, and I've noticed the same thing. We generally have much larger audiences on this channel when it comes to talking about a specific storm or wildfire event, which is, I think, understandable in a sense, but it is a goal of mine, and it's something that all of you in the audience can help with too, by sharing this channel and subscribing, and that's sort of the currency of social media these days is virality, and it's difficult to go viral if you're offering a more subtle, measured message. That's just not what's designed to go viral, so you kind of have to force the issue, and it's something that I'm happy to enlist the Weather West audience in the service of achieving. There's a question about whether AI-trained models reduce the need for science. AI gives answers without considering underlying science or fundamentals, physics. Perhaps the administration forecasts this is an outcome. This is probably a topic for another day, just because it is a very salient question, and also one that can't be answered easily. I think the short answer to the sort of the headline there, do AI models reduce the need for science, is no. And I'm very much sort of in a kind of, again, once again, kind of in the middle here, where I think there are some pretty incredible use cases for the AI-based methods and tools that we already have, and there will be even more spectacular applications of these sorts of tools moving forward. And yet, also, the degree to which we can rely on these tools for fundamental science, for new things, is, I still think, greatly overhyped. And so the idea that AI can replace science, particularly fundamental science, and scientists, humans, I think is just not correct. Just by not for any particular ideological reason, it just isn't empirically true so far. In fact, just today we were really attempting to use some of these really high-level models that people use for vibe coding and doing literature reviews, and realize that there are just some enormous gaps that remain that might be fundamental to the form, of LLMs, where they're very good at interrogating the existing body of knowledge in many ways, especially the existing body of well-documented knowledge, which is not always the same thing. Information's got to be there on the internet somewhere, but not so good at, or not usable, in fact, at all, in trying to develop new science or new hypotheses. And I understand that there are going to be folks in the comments who angrily are typing, that's not true in this specific instance, and I guarantee you that's true. There are instances where that has been proven to be very useful in developing new hypotheses or sifting through existing data and understanding to sort of refine the existing body of human knowledge in ways that are useful. And there's also process-based AI models. It's not entirely true anymore that AI models are all ignoring the underlying fundamental physics. In fact, some of these AI weather models are essentially learning conservation laws. They're learning the fluid dynamics of the atmosphere, and so therefore they can actually be really useful tools. But I think where we're seeing the biggest challenges in science is that where we're hitting kind of a brick wall, at least so far, is in going beyond the cutting edge of what we've already done. And this is true in weather and climate science and also elsewhere. And I think some really interesting examples has come from studies that use AI weather models to study changes in extreme weather in a warming climate. One, I think, fascinating study, and this appears to be true across different AI weather models in different domains, for example, is that they're pretty good at simulating extreme weather events up to the maximum magnitude that we've observed historically, because we have really good documentation of what's happened in the last 50 years. We have good modeling data sets, we have good observational data sets generally. But what they fail at is in producing extreme events that are greater than what we've observed historically. And that's concerning not just because of climate change, where the envelope of what's possible is broadening, but also just in terms of what we know about the way the world works. So for example, we know that in any given 100-year period, you're going to see extreme events of a certain magnitude that occur in a given part of the world. We also know that it's very likely that it's physically possible that in a different 100-year period that just the natural world could have thrown something even greater at us. So if you sample over 1 million years, say, in an unchanging climate, a completely static climate over time, and you choose a random 100-year period from within it to say the maximum wind speed observed in that 100-year period must be the maximum wind speed that can occur over even 1 million years in this part of the world, you're very likely to be wrong just by random chance. It's very unlikely that you would have happened to have sampled the 100-year period with the very worst that Mother Nature can throw at us during that particular century. So if we have a model that says that storms can't get any bigger than the ones we've seen historically, that probably means that there's something fundamentally wrong with the way these models are representing the upper part of that distribution, for example. So it's just, and it doesn't mean that that's a fundamental intrinsic limit on what AI approaches can do moving forward. In fact, I have colleagues and I'm actively collaborating with to sort of extend that so that we don't run into these brick walls nearly as soon as we currently are in some of these spaces. But I think the idea that the broader notion that you can just replace the existing body of research, the existing international consortium of all of these hundreds or even thousands of experts on climate science with, for example, Grok, the former Twitter, Elon Musk generated large language model that is embedded within the social media platform X these days, which is being used now to write the next national climate assessment instead of a team of expert authors. I have a not so bold prediction that this is not going to go very well. Let's just say. So, truthiness comes to mind as a concept, if you recall the Stephen Colbert in character term from the last decade. That's all I'll say about that for today. Just looking at the remaining comments today here. Yeah, thanks for sharing, and thanks for promoting the channel. That's how we grow it, folks. All right, here. Wrapping up, just reading the last few comments here, seeing if there's any more questions here. Okay. Well, I just want to close in saying that, well, NCAR is an invaluable American institution. It would be patently ridiculous to blow it up for no reason. I certainly, sincerely hope that the partisan political politics of the moment does not result in that outcome. I'm reasonably optimistic that there are multiple off-ramps at this point because Congress is not behind the dismantling of NCAR. The funding will be there for NSF to support NCAR. Even if NSF decides to completely or partially defund NCAR, there could potentially be other avenues to refund NCAR. Again, this is not a multi-billion-dollar kind of entity. It's in the low hundreds of millions on an annual basis, which sounds like a lot of money for any one person, but for an organization its size, it's quite frankly not. So, because it is operated again by a nonprofit consortium of universities, there could be some clever solutions if push comes to shove, and it does in fact come to this point. But I hope it doesn't. I hope that common sense prevails. I hope that the bipartisan agreement regarding the importance of the activities that NCAR engages in prevails, and that we see that NCAR continues to thrive through 2026 and beyond. So if you want to get involved with that, there's again that pinned link in the chat to make some calls to your representatives. If you're so inclined, a brief script to describe what you can say in that short phone call. And I appreciate your patience with the lagginess of this live stream. And if you are a live stream engineer or you work for YouTube, please do feel free to reach out to me and help me figure out what the heck is going on, because I really don't know. It's not the internet connection, so got to troubleshoot that one. So thanks for joining, and hopefully by the time next time rolls around, I will have figured out what's going on when I can no longer blame the squirrels. One brief programming note is that next week I do have jury duty, so I do not know whether I will be able to reach folks during normal business hours for a little while, so we will see how that goes. Fortunately, the weather conditions in California are on the quiet side for the moment, so there shouldn't be any urgent extreme weather need to hop online next week. So with all of that, thank you, and talk to you next time.